First of all, thank you, Dr. Krishna, for giving me an opportunity to share space with Dr. Tharoor, and congratulations on your book, sir. I've had the opportunity to go through it, at least the important portions of it. And as someone who typically doesn't use a pen to mark on a book, I was forced to do it this time because there are certain aspects that I came across. The one thing that I certainly agree with Dr. Krishna on is that for all practical purposes, my book is perhaps an inadvertent rebuttal of yours. And my book was released on August 13th. Last week was actually the Chennai release, so to speak. And the good thing that I've done, and this is not an attempt at self-edification, is that I have steered clear of all the Hindutva ideologues, so to speak, in building my case, which is that there is no reference to Savarkar whatsoever. There is no reference whatsoever to even Tagore or Gandhi or anybody else for that matter. And let me start with perhaps a factual correction. Kindly indulge me. Hindutva was not coined by Savarkar. Hindutva was coined by Chandranath Boshu in 1892 in his essay on Hindutva specifically. Long before Savarkar actually wrote on the subject, someone had already thought of it and had actually fleshed out its embodiment, so to speak, and Chandranath Boshu. Yes. So Hindutva, unfortunately or fortunately, is attributed to the mind of Savarkar when in fact it's not. So that's the first factual correction. Second, I wouldn't dare use the word criticism because I would be stepping into too large a shoes. I wouldn't do that. But my own impression of your book is that perhaps it takes a truncated view of what people crudely dub as Hindu nationalism. I have addressed certain parts of that actually as part of my book. The idea is to place the current movement and the awakening of this particular society within the larger canvas of what global scholarship refers to as decoloniality, which is to basically say that post-colonial societies are trying to shed the baggage of post-colonialism and wear the lens of decoloniality to be able to re-access their past and not recreate their past, but to re-inscribe certain values of the past in the institutions of the present and hopefully chart a more indigenous future. But it's not possible to completely create an indigenous future simply because it happens to be an integrated world. And that's the reality that you have to deal with and actively engage with. So the idea is to create perhaps a hybrid future which has a greater quotient of indigeneity as opposed to coloniality. Let me say this with as much humility as I can marshal at this point, that perhaps your previous book on the British colonial period, as well as this book, completely missed the scholarship of decoloniality, because unfortunately, Bharat's experience with colonialism is being approached with a blinkered vision, and I'm making a reference to a general school of thought, and I'm not making this personal at all. Because the idea that Hindu nationalism is fundamentally exclusionist and comes to the detriment of and at the peril of religious minorities in this country is to impose the guilt as well as the framework of European nationalism on Bharatiya consciousness. And every mistake and every folly and every massacre or every genocide which was perpetrated in the name of European nationalism is somehow consciously and unconsciously sought to be transposed onto Bharatiya reawakening. I do not wish to call it Hindutva, I do not wish to call it, any Twa, so to speak. I will simply call it Bharatiya Dharmic Civilizational Reawakening, which is what it translates to. The problem is, unfortunately, whenever this discussion starts, we seem to be fixated with certain personalities, which is Savarkar, so on and so forth. I am happy to completely discard Savarkar, and I'm sure this is going to get me a lot of hate mail, completely discard Savarkar to build a case for Hindu civilizationalism or Dharmic civilizationalism, because it is possible to do so. And the concept of Dharmic civilizationalism is much larger than any single individual. And to box it and lay it at the doors entirely of one particular person simply because he comes from an inconvenient political camp, so to speak, or espouses a certain cause that may not be politically correct, would be to do grave injustice to the society using one particular individual as the strawman of the argument. So therefore, it is my position, and I say this with all humility, that with due respect to Sri Savarkar and his contributions, because I've seen the tone as well as the manner in which you refer to him, I'm absolutely sure that it's not possible for us to glorify all parts of any individual. You would agree with that. Be it Mahatma Gandhi, or at least I refer to him as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I choose not to refer to him as Mahatma Gandhi. Pardon me for saying so. Or for that matter, Dr. Ambedkar. I don't think there is a single individual, if you choose to start scrutinizing them, that you would find yourself agreeing with all parts of everything that they say. Be that as it may, you try and make do with those parts which you believe, define them, characterize them. Therefore, for all his flaws or whatever they may be, Savarkar was effectively putting forth a position which was already in public domain, and he was capturing a certain spirit. But be that as it may, I don't wish to be the mouthpiece of Savarkar here. The point is, it is possible, and it must be so, that you look at this particular concept of dharmic civilizationalism independent of the lens of European nationalism. Unfortunately, the moment this discussion starts, I think people start cherry picking certain facts, which is that the constitution is fundamentally antithetical to, or is it loggerheads with, the Hindutva vision of a Hindu Rashtra, so to speak. So perhaps you may want to look at the draft constitution that was presented by the Hindu Mahasabha, which actually promised equal rights to religious minorities. And the reason why this is important for us to point out is because, assuming for a moment that we did not have the concept of contemporary constitutionalism emanating from Europe, even then, Bharat as a civilization has always welcomed those people who are willing to live with us. We did not have a constitution when persecuted Parsis knocked at the doors of Bharat. We did not have a constitution when, let's say, the Jews from your state, so to speak, and even from the Northeast, knocked at the doors of Bharat. So to attribute certain large-heartedness entirely to the constitution, I would say, is to protect the constitution at the expense of the civilization, which I think is grave injustice.
I've never done that.
I'll just finish my point.
When you finish.
So as far as I am concerned, to assume that the constitution is somehow a civilizing tool which seeks to educate and civilize and let's say uplift a certain regressive society which is at loggerheads with the value of constitutionalism, which doesn't know what is democracy, which doesn't know what it is to accommodate minorities, no. It is a product of the fundamental spirit of this particular land, and despite the horrors of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality and tragedy of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality of the two-nation theory, which was specifically foisted on us, which we must never forget, I think this country has done a vastly superior job of protecting its minorities than our former, let's say, estranged cousins, so to speak. And I think the proof of that lies in the fact. So it actually is very, very surprising when we are constantly told that this particular country, if it becomes a Hindu Rashtra, or if it becomes a dharmic civilizational state, so to speak, is bound to become what you refer to in your book as the Hindu Pakistan. I'm sorry, I think that's grave injustice to the people of this country, because accommodation is something, an accommodation, not Western style assimilation. Accommodation has been the spirit of this country, because Western style assimilation requires you to convert to their way of life in one form or the other, either overtly or covertly, in order for you to be accepted as part of the particular society. It is this country that makes it possible for people to keep their culture alive in the most perhaps pristine form possible, so long as it does not come in the way of others. So I would actually make the case that dharmic civilizationalism is what is crudely dubbed as Hindu nationalism. And as a student of constitutional law, not to claim specific expertise or drop names here, I believe that whenever public morality has been referred to in the Constituent Assembly debates, the reference has been to the reservoir of this country's public morality drawn from the vast ocean of dharma. And as far as I understand, the concept of dharma is native to this particular land, so to speak, and its culture. And there is one clarification or correction that I think is very, very important, that it's possible to simply reduce the so-called Indic reawakening, so to speak, as identity politics. It's possible to muddle it to the level of identity politics. In my humble opinion, that would be perhaps the most superficial way of looking at it. Because scholarship, psychology, political science, as well as students of history strike a very clear distinction between identity and consciousness, which is to say you can be a Hindu in name and still think like a foreigner, because your language and your accent and everything could be something that is completely alien to this land. So according to me, identity is less important and consciousness is more important, which is why if I had to choose between an Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh, I would choose a Dara Shikoh simply because in consciousness, he was closer to the Hindu spirit, notwithstanding his identity. But Aurangzeb, for all practical purposes, his consciousness and identity were one and the same and completely antithetical to the nature of this land and its accommodative spirit. So that is the distinction.